Okay, it's mid-August 2021, and this is going to be my third video about ivermectin because it seems to be such a hot topic. The first video that I did about it was about 8 months ago, and in that video, I reviewed basically the literature review from this website, which is the FLCCC Alliance. This is an advocacy group promoting ivermectin as part of their COVID treatment protocol, and they had they have a lot of information here about ivermectin, and so I reviewed that about 8 months ago, and they've been updating it the whole time. And on this website, they talked about powerful new evidence for reducing COVID-19 deaths using ivermectin, and they referenced this meta-analysis and systematic review that was in my most recent ivermectin video. Since this came out, so this was a very well done study, and in the video I talked about a couple of the caveats to this study. They weren't the comparison groups weren't compared using more modern drugs that are available in Western countries, and if you look at their methodology, they excluded a large number of papers and included some papers, and it's not clear exactly why they excluded some and why they included others. And I said, you just have to kind of you have to either do one of two things. You have to either like go through this thing yourself and systematically look at every paper and decide for yourself if the included papers were the correctly included papers, or if you don't have time to do that, you just have to assume that there is no overt bias in the authorship, and hope that they are doing this in a unbiased fashion. So since this came out, there have been a couple of developments. Several people have looked over this and realized that many of these authors have been promoting ivermectin for a long time. Tess Lawrie especially is part of this group. She's one of the founders of this group called the Bird Group, which is essentially the United Kingdom's version of the um, FLCCC. They're a ivermectin promotion group. So, there is some bias in the authors. Most of these people are associated with the Bird Group, and so they have a bias to say that ivermectin is good, because they've already kind of put that as their position before writing this paper. Now, that doesn't mean necessarily that the science is bad, because most scientists are human and most scientists have a bias. And so you can't, people are not unbiased, and there's no such thing as an unbiased person doing science. Um, so you can't just discount it because they have a bias. You have to go through the fundamentals of the work and the methodology and see if their bias affected their paper. And for the most part, their methodology seems good, but there are a couple of problems that this epidemiologist noted in the paper, and I wanted to go over them. One is that there is something called publication bias. This is a well-known thing in all science, where basically people tend to publish papers that have positive results, and they tend to not publish papers that have negative results. For example, if I was researching a cancer drug and I tested it in a bunch of people and it didn't work, I'm unlikely to spend the time to write a paper just to say, well, this thing didn't work. Um, and also, if I write that paper, it's pretty it's less likely that a journal would publish something that says it didn't work, because they're like, well, that's not very exciting, and who cares? And that's been one of the things that scientists have been talking about, that we do need to publish more negative papers. We need to publish papers that say that that we say, like, we tried this drug for this disease and it didn't work, so that in the future we know, well, people have tried that, it didn't work. And it becomes more important as these systematic reviews are being done, that people publish negative results. But there is a publication bias. This is not just something for ivermectin or for COVID. This is a thing that's in across all science. There is a publication bias. So we just have to know that from the things that are published, it's more likely you're going to find things that show a positive result than things that show a negative result. So the bias is already there to show that some drug works. And then the other thing that he found out is that two papers, especially that they included, the this Elgazzar paper, I don't know how to pronounce his name, Elgazzar or Elgazzar, oh, and this Nye paper, they seem to have significant problems and inconsistencies. And subsequently, this Elgazzar paper was retracted. Um, Basically, they found a bunch of papers with it. So the paper's irregularities came to light when Jack Lawrence, a master's student at University of London, he was reading it for a class assignment and noticed that some phrases were identical to those in other published works. When he contacted researchers who specialize in detecting fraud in scientific publications, the group found other causes for concern, including dozens of patient records that seemed to be duplicates. So they had a lot of duplicate data points, inconsistencies between the raw data and information on the paper. So the information that they wrote in the paper did not match the raw data dumps. So either there was a mistake or fraud, one or the other. And then patient records that indicated they died before the study start date. So they had patients in their study that their medical records show that they were dead at the time that the study supposedly started, and numbers that seem to be too consistent to have occurred by chance. So this doesn't mean that they made up numbers, but maybe they did. Statistically, these numbers didn't seem like they would be actual numbers. So anyway, for various reasons, this paper was retracted, and this paper had one of the most positive results. And so um, it's a large paper with large positive results, and it would kind of skew any systematic review. So basically, this guy took this paper's systematic review and reran the analysis while kicking out these two papers. And when he does that, he finds that that there isn't much of an effect, almost none. All right, so the whole thing is confusing. You have pretty well-respected people that are pushing for ivermectin, and then you have very respected people that are saying, you know what, we just don't have the information for ivermectin. Um, And so, it definitely, like, this Elgazzar paper had flaws and they retracted it. So that was a big part of this thing. So probably the amount of effect is not as great as this systematic review tended to indicate. But here's the good thing. If you look at this paper, they keep talking about this thing called Cochrane, okay? The conduct of this review is guided by a protocol that was initially written using Cochrane's rapid review template. And then, they using assessments were conducted by two reviewers using the Cochrane randomized control trial risk of bias tool. And then we used Cochrane effective practice and organization of care guidelines to interpret the evidence. So what is this Cochrane? So Cochrane is a group that is one of the most respected groups that reviews the literature, does systematic reviews, and gives clinical care guidelines for a wide variety of diseases, like almost every kind of diseases across all specialties. So Cochrane is a very well-respected group, and this group that did this systematic review that I looked at in my previous video, they basically are saying, hey, we did something very similar to a Cochrane review, and here's our results. Since this was done, Cochrane themselves did a review of ivermectin. So you know, the original, the Cochrane library did a review. These guys have no declaration of interest with ivermectin. So hold on one second. Computer's locking up. Okay, here we go. We're back. All right, so they're talking about, the same thing. Ivermectin has got a lot of interest, and we decided. So we included randomized controlled trials comparing ivermectin to no treatment, standard of care, placebo, or another proven intervention irrespective of disease severity, treated inpatient or outpatient. Okay, so they excluded studies comparing ivermectin to things that did not work, because obviously ivermectin is going to look better if you compare it to something that has been proven to not work at all. So they said they found 14 studies with 1,678 participants investigating um, ivermectin to no treatment, placebo, or standard of care. No study compared ivermectin to an intervention with proven efficacy. So this was obviously the problem that we kind of talked about in the previous video, because most of these studies were done in third world countries and they don't have access to a lot of the things that have proven efficacy. So they're comparing it to things that aren't the kind of the best standard of care in Western countries that have more resources. There were 9 studies treating participants with moderate and 4 treating mild. 1 study investigated ivermectin for the prevention of infection. 8 studies had open label design. 6 were double blinded and placebo controlled. Of the 41 studies contributed, about 1/3 were at overall high risk of bias. So about a third of them they thought were not great studies because of the methodology. They identified 31 ongoing and 18 studies awaiting classification. So there's a lot of information that's coming down the pipeline, okay? All right, so this is their non-scientific summary, for the lay people. So they found no evidence to support the use of ivermectin for treating or preventing COVID-19 infection, but the evidence is limited. So they're not saying that ivermectin doesn't work. They're just saying that after they reviewed the literature, they did not find enough evidence to say it does work. So it just means that we don't know. It could work. We just don't have the evidence yet, or enough evidence. And people are like saying, well, there's like 50 papers published about it with randomized controlled trials from all these countries that that seem to say that it does work. The problem is number one, a lot of them had problems when they did the risk of bias assessment, so those studies aren't great. And then two, all of them compared ivermectin to a placebo or no treatment or standard treatment in those countries, which is not the same as the standard treatment in higher resource countries. So they don't know if it works better compared to the best known current treatment. All right. So here's a summary of findings. So they thought that it reduced, when they looked at their papers, it reduced the risk of dying by 40%, but you can see their 95% confidence interval is huge. It's like it could be as much as 85% reduction, or it could be as bad as it caused people to die 2.5 times more often. So according to their analysis, ivermectin could be anywhere from 85 stopping 85% of deaths or increasing deaths 2.5-fold. So, and then they said that the certainty evidence was very low. And so basically they just thought that there was not any good studies. And I think in here they talk about why they excluded some of the papers, because you'll see that in here, in this previous systematic review, they had probably like 17 papers included in their analysis, a lot. I don't know. I'm not going to count these, but it looks like 20 or so. In here, I think they only included like 3 or 4, because in their opinion, after they did the risk of bias assessment, only 3 or 4 were even worth doing. All right, here we go. I think I'm getting to it at some point here. Okay, here we go. So they went through here, they found 318, they excluded these because they weren't relevant papers. So like compare this chart to this chart. So in here they found 600 records and they excluded 512. They were got down to 82. In this one they got down to 143, and then they found 57 records. So that's 57 versus 82. And then they found 13 studies that they thought were worth including in their systematic review. This one, they found 24 studies that they included. And then they say, okay, here's what they said. We included 14 studies describing 1,678 adults. Yeah, so this is their kind of summary of the studies that they included. 3 were multi-center studies in Argentina. Okay. Yeah, 4 studies were funded by pharmaceutical companies producing ivermectin. So, one of the things is people are like, oh, we have all these studies about other drugs that are supported by the drug company. So, they probably have some bias. Well, 4 of these studies were funded by pharmaceutical companies that were making ivermectin. I think they talk about why they excluded a certain other studies. Okay, yeah, here we go. Excluded studies. We excluded 38 studies that did not match our inclusion criteria. 12 studies evaluated a combination of ivermectin with other treatments. So they're telling us here. So this is what they didn't have in the other paper. They didn't say why they excluded certain papers. So here they're telling us, here's why we excluded these 38 papers. 12 of them studied a combination of ivermectin. So their study group was ivermectin with something else. So then it's hard to say, was it the ivermectin that was helping the patients, or was it something else that was helping the patients, the other thing that they were adding? So they're mixing a lot of different stuff, so it's hard to parse out ivermectin as the treatment effect. So 8 studies investigated active comparators without proven efficacy. So 8 studies compared ivermectin with something else that's proven not to work. So then if you compare a drug with something that doesn't work, obviously it's going to look better. One of these studies was retracted by the research group. They're talking about the Elgazzar study. So, and then 4 studies investigated wrong intervention. 5 studies analyzed the wrong study population, including RT-PCR negative participants. So this is the NIE study. So basically, they included patients that did not have COVID-19. They didn't have it. So they were investigating ivermectin on patients that didn't have COVID-19. So, I mean, obviously that's a problem. And then 9 studies were not randomized control studies. Okay, so anyways, they studied. So Cochrane review, which is basically the gold standard of systematic analysis places, they reviewed 14 studies, and these people don't have a bias. They don't have any dog in the fight, and they found that it had if you look at them, it had a 40% death reduction, but the 95% confidence interval. So the data is so widespread that this is an average, but it could be anywhere from reducing death by 85%, 86% to increasing death by 2.5 times, so 251%. So, and they only had 2 RCTs that controlled this, and they thought the evidence was very low. So their conclusion is, based on the current very low to low certainty evidence, we are uncertain about the efficacy and safety of ivermectin used to treat or prevent COVID-19. The completed studies are small, few are considered high quality. Several studies are underway that may produce clearer results in review updates. Overall, reliable evidence does not support the use of ivermectin for treatment or prevention of COVID-19 outside of well-designed randomized trials. Okay. So that's the current state of evidence. And I tend to agree with Cochrane that the evidence is low. Here's the caveat to that. There are lots of things we do in medicine for which the evidence is low or sometimes non-existent. I'll give you an example from my field. So I am an ear, nose, and throat surgeon, and one of the things we deal with is something called sudden sensory neural hearing loss. And if you went to an ENT and you had this condition, sudden sensory neural hearing loss, there's essentially a 100% chance that you're going to get treated with steroids, that the ENT you see is going to give you steroids. Like we all do it. Like 99.9% of us do it. Here's the conclusion of the Cochrane review on the status of the data for steroids in the treatment of sudden sensory neural hearing loss. The value of steroids in the treatment of idiopathic sudden sensory neural hearing loss remains unclear since the evidence obtained from randomized controls is contradictory in outcome, in part because these studies are based upon too small a number of patients. So the Cochrane review is basically saying there isn't enough evidence to say that steroids work or do anything for this condition. But I will tell you that 99.9% of ENTs will give you steroids if you have this condition. Because, medicine we can't work until the evidence is 100% clear. Um, we got to do something until the evidence gets there, right? And so that's kind of why these doctors are promoting ivermectin. I mean, I think they've kind of made it an advocacy group. So in my opinion, they oversell it. But they're just thinking, hey, this thing seems to help, and we can't wait for the evidence to be, locked tight, and they should try it. So going back to what I said in the previous video, I think when we look at things with uncertain evidence, you have to do the risk-benefit analysis on it. And ivermectin we know is pretty safe. And so I think giving it a try is not a crazy thing. The evidence is not great. There isn't like clear-cut evidence, but we do a lot of things in medicine not based on not great evidence. We do a lot of things that don't have clear right or wrong answers. Um, and we do what we think is the best thing for the patient at the time. And I don't think there's definitely not evidence to say that ivermectin is bad, and there's no great evidence to say that it's good. A little bit of the evidence seems to kind of point toward that it's good, and there's a lot of better studies coming down the pipeline, so hopefully that'll become clearer. But at this point, I think that the risk benefit is fairly neutral for ivermectin, and so I think if a doctor wanted to use it, it's not a crazy thing to do. But that's just but the if you want to say, is there clear evidence that it works? At this point, there is not, and it doesn't mean that there won't be evidence coming down the pipeline that shows that it does work. It just means we don't know right now. So saying that there's no evidence doesn't that it that there's very little evidence that it works is not the same as saying that it doesn't work, if that makes sense. And again, like I said, in medicine, we do a lot of things that don't have clear cut, there's not a randomized controlled trial for everything, There's not a randomized controlled trial that says that, parachutes help you when you jump out of planes. But it's pretty clear that it does. And so a lot of times in medicine, we can't wait for the clear cut evidence. And maybe this is one of the things. Clearly, some doctors feel that way. The guys that are in this FLCC and the people that are in this bird group, they feel like, hey, in our opinion, the evidence is good enough. But from a purely objective standpoint, there just really isn't that great evidence for it right now. And hopefully that'll become clearer. The risk-benefit profile, again, for ivermectin, the risk of it is pretty low. So I think if ivermectin was a drug that had a lot of side effects or significant side effects, I personally would be like, no, with this level of evidence, we're not. I don't think it's a good idea. But since it's a pretty low risk thing, so low risk, probably low benefit, might be worth a shot.